torn dress. The reason will break your heart. The morning light fell across the marble floors of the Blackwood estate like liquid gold, streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over 12 acres of manicured gardens, a private lake, and a guest house larger than most American families would ever call home. Ethan Blackwood moved through his mansion the way he moved through boardrooms, purposefully, efficiently, with a kind of quiet authority that came not from arrogance, but from years of building something extraordinary out of almost nothing. At 32, he was the youngest self-made billionaire in the technology sector, a man whose name graced the covers of Forbes and Time, whose company had revolutionized the way hospitals across the country managed patient data, saving thousands of lives annually. He was the kind of man people wrote articles about, studied in business schools, admired from a distance. But that Tuesday morning, it wasn't a business journal or an admiring colleague that stopped Ethan Blackwood in his tracks. It was a tiny girl sitting on the bottom step of his grand staircase, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit to her chest, wearing a pale yellow dress with a jagged tear running from the shoulder seam all the way down to her ribs. The fabric gaped open, exposing her small shoulder to the cool morning air of the air-conditioned house. She couldn't have been more than 3 years old, her dark curls tumbling around a face that was angelic in its proportions, wide brown eyes, a button nose, full cheeks still carrying the softness of babyhood. She was humming something quietly to herself, a tuneless little melody, completely unaware that one of the most powerful men in America had just stopped dead in the middle of his own hallway to stare at her. Ethan's housekeeper, Rosa Mendez, appeared from the kitchen doorway half a second later, her face flushing crimson the moment she saw the direction of his gaze. Rosa was 44 years old, a woman of extraordinary quiet dignity, who had worked for Ethan for 3 years since he'd purchased the estate. She was meticulous, warm, and deeply professional, the kind of person who remembered how he took his coffee without being asked, who made sure fresh flowers appeared in his home office every Monday morning, who ran his household with a calm efficiency that mirrored his own approach to business. "Mr. Blackwood, I am so sorry," Rosa said immediately, crossing the marble floor with quick steps. "Lily isn't supposed to be out here. My sister was supposed to watch her today, but there was an emergency, and I had no other choice but to bring her. It won't happen again, I promise you. I'll keep her in the kitchen. She won't be in your way." "Rosa." Ethan held up a hand gently, cutting her off. He was still looking at the little girl. "It's okay. What's her name?" Rosa blinked, clearly surprised by the absence of irritation in his voice. "Lily. Her name is Lily. She's my daughter. She's 3. Ethan crouched down, something that was notable in itself for a man who'd conducted billion-dollar negotiations without ever softening his posture, and looked at the little girl at eye level. Lily stared back at him with the complete, unashamed curiosity of a toddler, tilting her head slightly to one side, her stuffed rabbit dangling from one hand. "Hi, Lily," Ethan said. "Hi," Lily said simply. Then she held up her rabbit. "This is Mr. Flops." "Mr. Flops," Ethan repeated seriously, as though this were a formal introduction. "It's nice to meet him." Lily smiled, a sudden, full-faced smile that made something shift in Ethan's chest in a way he hadn't felt in a very long time. Then his eyes dropped, almost involuntarily, to the torn dress. The tear was significant, not a small snag or a loose thread, but a real, substantial rip, the kind that suggested the garment had been mended before, perhaps more than once. The fabric weakened along old stitch lines until it had given way entirely. The dress itself was clean, carefully laundered, but it was too small, the hemline sitting well above Lily's knees, the sleeves slightly straining at her chubby arms. Someone had dressed this child with love. Everything about her was neat. Her curls were brushed, her small hands were clean, but the dress was telling a story that the careful grooming was working hard to conceal. Ethan straightened up slowly. He looked at Rosa, and Rosa looked back at him with the particular expression of a woman bracing herself, not for anger, but for something worse. Pity. The kind of pity that made you feel smaller than anger ever could. But what Ethan said was simply, "Has she eaten breakfast?" Rosa blinked again. Yes. I brought some food for her from home." "Okay." He nodded once. "Let her play in the sunroom." Mrs. Henderson's grandkids left some toys in the storage room off the kitchen. "She told me to donate them. Lily might as well enjoy them first." He paused. "And Rosa, that dress. What happened to it?" There was a silence. Not a long one, but weighted. Rosa's chin lifted slightly, with the dignity of a woman who had navigated difficult questions before. "It tore this morning," she said quietly. "I didn't have time to change her. I didn't have anything else to change her into." She said it simply, without elaboration, without apology. Just the plain truth, offered with the quiet courage of someone who had long since stopped being ashamed of reality. Ethan nodded again, his face giving nothing away. "Okay," he said. He walked to his home office. He sat down at his desk. He pulled up his morning briefing, 3 acquisitions pending, a board meeting that afternoon, a charity gala on Friday that his PR team had been pushing him to attend. He read 2 lines of the first document. Then he put his phone down and stared at the window. The image of that torn dress, clean but broken, loved but inadequate, sat in his mind like a splinter he couldn't ignore. In his 32 years of life, Ethan Blackwood had seen poverty in the abstract. He'd grown up with it, actually, the son of a single father in Dayton, Ohio, eating government cheese and wearing secondhand shoes and understanding from a very early age that the world was divided into people who had enough and people who were always one bad week away from not having enough. He'd clawed his way out of that world with his intellect and his relentless, almost pathological work ethic. And somewhere along the way, somewhere between the first million and the first billion, the memory of what it felt like to be without had become theoretical. A story he told at motivational speaking events. A paragraph in profiles about his humble origins. But that little girl in the torn yellow dress wasn't theoretical. She was 3 years old. She was sitting in his sunroom right now, probably talking to Mr. Flops with a solemn sincerity that only toddlers could manage. And her dress was torn because her mother didn't have another one to give her. Ethan Blackwood, who had not cried since his father's funeral 4 years ago, felt the back of his throat tighten in a way that surprised him completely. He picked up his phone. Not to call his assistant. Not to call his board. He opened a search engine and typed, "Children's clothing stores near me, open now." There are stories people carry in their bodies rather than their words. Stories pressed into the set of a jaw, the careful straightness of a spine, the way a woman's hands move just slightly too quickly when she's trying to appear untroubled. Ethan Blackwood had built his fortune partly on his ability to read people, to hear what wasn't being said in a room, to understand the full architecture of a situation from its visible edges. It was a skill born from necessity. Growing up without money meant learning early to read the mood of a room before you walked into it, to understand when a smile was genuine and when it was a mask that someone needed you to believe in. He recognized Rose's mask the way you recognize the face of an old acquaintance. Later that morning, under the pretense of discussing the week's household schedule, Ethan sat across from Rosa at the kitchen island and asked her, carefully and without drama, how things were going. Rosa, who was a woman of great precision, told him things were fine. The house was fine. The new cleaning schedule he'd approved was working well. The garden team was doing good work on the east hedges. Ethan listened to all of it. Then he said, quietly, "Rosa, how are things actually going?" Another silence. Rosa had her hands wrapped around a coffee mug, and he watched her knuckles pale slightly with the grip before she released it. She looked out the kitchen window at the garden, at the roses currently blooming against the old stone wall, extravagant and excessive in the way that only things tended by professional gardeners could be. "We're managing," she said finally. "What does managing look like?" he asked. And then, because Ethan had asked with a directness that left no comfortable evasion available, and because Rosa Mendez was fundamentally an honest woman who had grown very, very tired of carrying everything alone, she told him. She told him about her husband, Marco, who had been a construction foreman for 17 years, a strong and capable man who had never missed a day of work in his life until 14 months ago, when he'd fallen from scaffolding on a job site and shattered his left leg in 4 places. She told him about the surgery, and then the second surgery, and then the infection that had led to a third surgery, and the 4 months Marco had spent in the hospital, and the 8 months since then of rehabilitation and pain management and mounting medical debt. She told him about the workers' compensation claim that the company's insurance carrier had been fighting, disputing the circumstances of the fall, delaying payment, burying them in paperwork, while their savings evaporated and then vanished entirely. She told him about the apartment they'd lost, and the smaller apartment they'd moved into, and the way Lily had cried for 2 nights about leaving her bedroom, the one Rosa had painted yellow, Lily's favorite color, with the little moon and stars she'd stenciled above the crib herself. She told him, in the flat and steady voice of a woman reporting facts rather than grieving them, that they were currently behind on rent by 6 weeks. That Marco's medication cost $412 a month even with insurance. That her sister, who watched Lily on the days Rosa worked, had had to take a second job herself, which was why Lily was here today. She told him that the torn dress was the only dress Lily owned that still fit her, because Rosa had been buying Lily's clothes from the donation bin at their church, and the last time she'd found something in Lily's size was 3 months ago. She'd been meaning to mend it properly, she said, but the needle and thread she'd been using had run out, and she hadn't. Her voice caught, fractionally, barely enough to notice. She hadn't had $4 to replace it. $4. Ethan sat very still as Rosa talked. He didn't interrupt. He didn't perform sympathy with nods and sounds. He simply listened, with the full and careful attention that was perhaps the rarest thing a powerful person could offer someone without power. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Why didn't you tell me any of this?" he asked. Rosa looked at him with something complicated in her expression, pride and exhaustion in equal measure, and beneath both of them, a deep and protective dignity. "Because my troubles are not your responsibility, Mr. Blackwood," she said. "I take care of your home. That's the arrangement. I don't want charity. I don't want," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "I don't want to be seen differently." Ethan understood that. He understood it in his bones, in the part of himself that was still the kid from Dayton who'd refused the free lunch program in 7th grade because he couldn't stand the way it felt to have something labeled for people like him. Pride wasn't stubbornness. It wasn't stupidity. It was the last thing a person got to keep when everything else had been taken, and it was worth more than most people who'd never lost anything understood. "I hear you," he said. "And I want you to know that nothing I say or do today is charity. Nothing I'm about to do is because I feel sorry for you. Do you understand?" Rosa watched him carefully. "What I do in the next few days," Ethan said, "is because I'm a man who believes in being useful when he can be. And because Lily introduced me to Mr. Flops this morning, and that makes her someone I have an obligation to look out for." He said it lightly, but he meant it completely. "Okay." Rosa's eyes filled. She didn't let them spill. She was too composed for that, too practiced at holding herself together. But her eyes filled, and she pressed her lips together, and she nodded once. "Okay," she said. From the sunroom, they could hear Lily explaining something elaborate and important to Mr. Flops, her small voice rising and falling with the passionate conviction of a person who had very firm opinions about whatever she was discussing. Despite everything, Rosa laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her, warm and involuntary. Ethan smiled. He stood up from the kitchen island and said, as casually as if he were discussing a minor calendar item, "I'm going to step out for a bit this morning. Hold all my calls until noon." Rosa frowned slightly. His morning was supposed to be packed. "Your 9 o'clock conference call with Tokyo. Push it to tomorrow." He picked up his car keys from the hook by the garage entrance. He paused at the doorway and looked back at Rosa, who was still sitting at the kitchen island with her coffee mug and her dignified, brimming eyes. "Rosa," he said, You're one of the hardest working people I've ever known. And I've been in rooms with some of the hardest working people in the world. He left before she could respond. He wasn't looking for her gratitude. He had a 3-year-old girl to buy a dress for, and that was enough reason to cancel Tokyo. There was a moment, standing in the middle of a Target in suburban Connecticut, holding a small yellow sundress up to the fluorescent light and trying to remember what size a 3-year-old typically wore, when Ethan Blackwood became acutely aware of how thoroughly unprepared he was for this specific task. He was a man who had negotiated mergers worth 9 figures. He had stood before the Senate Subcommittee on Healthcare Technology and fielded 3 hours of aggressive questioning without losing his composure once. He had pitched his company to skeptical venture capitalists when he was 23 years old, wearing the only blazer he owned and knowing that if they said no, he had enough money left for 2 months of ramen noodles and not much else. He had faced down challenges that would have broken most people. But the children's section of a Target on a Tuesday morning had him genuinely stumped. There was a woman nearby, probably mid-30s, with a toddler of her own sitting in the cart, who noticed him standing there with a yellow dress and the expression of a man decoding a foreign language. She took pity on him. "How old?" she asked, nodding at the dress.
3, he said.
"Height? Is she on the smaller side, bigger side?" He thought about Lily. "She's regular size? Average? I honestly don't know. She comes up to about here on me." He held his hand at what he estimated was Lily's height against his thigh. The woman nodded with the brisk efficiency of someone who had navigated this terrain many times. 3T then, maybe 4T if you want room to grow. Always size up with kids. They grow out of things in about 30 seconds. She plucked a different yellow dress from the rack, a nicer one than the one he'd been holding, with small embroidered flowers along the collar, and handed it to him. "This one's better quality anyway, and it goes up to 4T. "Thank you," Ethan said, with a sincerity that seemed to slightly surprise her. "First kid?" she asked. He opened his mouth to explain, then stopped. "Something like that," he said. He did not buy one dress. Later, reflecting on it, he wasn't entirely sure what had shifted in him as he stood in that aisle, but something did. Something cracked open quietly and let in an awareness of the full shape of what Rosa and Lily were living. One dress would solve today's problem, but Lily would keep growing, and Rosa's situation wasn't going to resolve itself overnight. And the thought of that little girl in that small apartment with her $4 needle and thread problem and her single dress felt suddenly, viscerally, unacceptable to Ethan in a way that surprised him with its intensity. He bought 12 outfits. He bought them methodically, moving through the 3T and 4T racks with the same focused deliberateness he brought to research and due diligence, reading fabric labels, checking seam quality, selecting things that would last. He bought dresses and pants and soft leggings and 2 warm cardigans and a raincoat, bright red with a hood, the kind that would look wonderful on a dark-haired little girl in the middle of an April downpour. He bought pajamas with small rabbits on them, which seemed appropriate given Mr. Flop's prominence in Lily's life. He bought good shoes, sturdy ones in 2 sizes, because kids' feet grew, and he was done doing this one problem at a time. Then he walked over to the grocery section and stood there for a long moment. He was not a man given to impulse. Every major decision in his life had been made after careful analysis, structured thinking, the deliberate consideration of second and third-order consequences. But something about this particular morning had bypassed his analytical brain entirely and gone straight to somewhere older and more instinctive, somewhere that remembered what it felt like to be the kid whose backpack was held together with duct tape, whose school lunch account was always 4 weeks overdue, whose father worked double shifts at the plant and still came home apologizing. He bought groceries. Real groceries, not extravagant, not performative luxury, just the foundational abundance of a household that didn't have to count what it put in the cart. Chicken and vegetables and pasta and good bread and fruit, a whole watermelon, because he'd noticed Lily eyeing the decorative fruit bowl in his kitchen that morning with the specific longing of a child who understood that some things are for looking at and not for eating, and he wanted to give her something that was entirely, completely, messily hers. He drove back to the estate with the trunk full. He carried everything in himself, refusing the housekeeper app's offer to call for delivery. There was something important to him about the physical act of carrying it, something that had to do with not making this a transaction processed at a distance, not making it something that happened to Rosa from behind the shield of his wealth. Lily was in the sunroom when he came in, building an elaborate structure with the old toy blocks he'd had Mrs. Henderson dig out of storage. She looked up at him with those wide brown eyes when he appeared in the doorway, then looked at the large bags in his hands with the pure, transparent interest of a 3-year-old who had not yet learned to modulate her curiosity. "What ya got?" she asked. Ethan set the bags down and crouched to her level. "Some things," he said. "Wanna look?" She was already moving toward the bags before he finished the sentence. Mr. Flops abandoned temporarily in the face of this more immediate excitement. She pulled out the yellow sundress first, the one with the embroidered flowers, and held it up with an expression of such complete, uncomplicated delight that Ethan felt something break open in his chest in a way that was not unpleasant, but was very definite. "Pretty," Lily breathed, with the reverence of a person encountering something genuinely, unexpectedly beautiful. "It's yours," Ethan said. Lily looked at him. "Mine. Yours." She looked at the dress again. Then she looked up at him. "Thank you," she said, very seriously, with the grave formality of a child who'd been carefully taught manners and understood them as something real and important. "You're welcome, Lily," Ethan said. He heard Rosa in the doorway behind him. He didn't turn around. He didn't want to see her face, because he thought if he did, neither of them would be able to hold it together, and Lily didn't need to see the adults around her cry. Lily needed to try on a dress with embroidered flowers and let the morning be exactly what it was: simple and good. In the weeks that followed that Tuesday morning, Ethan Blackwood did something he'd never done in 3 years of living in that estate. He paid attention, not in the distracted, ambient way of an employer aware that employees exist. He paid the kind of attention that sees real, deliberate attention, the kind he normally reserved for problems he intended to solve. He noticed the bus Rosa took to reach the estate, 2 transfers, an hour and 20 minutes each way, 3 days a week. He noticed that she brought her lunch in a plastic container every day, carefully packed, always small portions, always exactly enough and not an ounce more. He noticed that her phone, the device she used to coordinate everything, to stay in touch with Marco, to manage Lily's schedule and her sister's schedule and the appointment calendar that governed their entire complicated, stretched-thin life, was a phone so old it had a cracked screen held together with a piece of clear tape. He noticed, one afternoon, that she had missed her usual departure time and was still at his kitchen table at 7 in the evening, working through what appeared to be a stack of medical billing documents, her reading glasses on, her pen moving in tight, controlled circles as she annotated items. He brought her a cup of tea. She looked up, startled. "You should have gone home an hour ago," he said. "I know," she said. "I just needed to." She gestured at the papers. "The insurance company denied Marco's claim again. I'm writing an appeal." Ethan sat down. "Can I look at it?" Rosa hesitated. "You don't need to." "Rosa," he said it gently, "I have a team of attorneys whose job is to untangle exactly this kind of thing. Let me look at it." He looked at it. What he found made him set down his tea very carefully and take a slow, measured breath. The denial was not, at its core, about the facts of Marco's case. It was about paperwork, about a single procedural form that had been submitted 4 days past a deadline, not because Rosa or Marco had been negligent, but because the hospital's billing department had sent the form to an address they no longer lived at, thanks to the move they'd been forced to make. It was the kind of bureaucratic trap that destroyed the lives of people without access to legal expertise routinely, invisibly, tucked inside language that was designed to be impenetrable to anyone who hadn't spent years learning to navigate it. Ethan photographed every document with his phone. That evening, he forwarded everything to the head of his legal team with a 2-line message: "Handle this. Full coverage. Call me with questions." He didn't tell Rosa immediately. He waited until his attorney called back 48 hours later with confirmation that the insurer had agreed to reprocess the claim based on the procedural error being attributable to the hospital rather than the claimant. Then he told her. Rosa sat with the information for a long moment, very still, in the same kitchen where she told him the truth about their lives 3 weeks earlier. "How did you do that?" she asked finally. "I have a very good legal team," he said simply. "Ethan." She used his first name, perhaps for the first time. It came out with the weight of everything she didn't know how to say. "You don't have to say anything," he said. But she did say something. She said, "You didn't have to do any of this." "No," he agreed. "But I wanted to. There's a difference." The insurance settlement, when it came through 6 weeks later, was significant: back pay for the months of denied claims, plus a negotiated lump sum for Marco's ongoing care costs. It wasn't life-changing in the way of fairy tales, but it was enough. Enough to clear the back rent and get back to stable ground. Enough for Marco to continue his rehabilitation with the consistency his recovery required. Enough that Rosa could stop doing her private mental calculations every time she bought groceries. But Ethan wasn't finished. Because in the weeks of paying attention, he'd also noticed something else about Rosa Mendez, something that had nothing to do with her current circumstances and everything to do with who she fundamentally was. She ran his household with a natural organizational intelligence that was genuinely remarkable. She anticipated problems before they became problems. She managed vendors, contractors, and schedules with an intuitive efficiency that he recognized from his best people in the corporate world. She remembered every detail, followed up on every loose thread, communicated clearly and without drama. She was, in the language of his industry, operationally exceptional. He knew she had a business administration degree. She'd mentioned it once, in passing, with the particular careful neutralness of someone accustomed to that fact being irrelevant to their current situation. She'd stopped working in the field after Lily was born, taken the housekeeping position for the flexibility and the income, set the rest of herself aside. Ethan had a position opening up in his company's operations division, not a junior position, not an entry-level concession to someone he felt sorry for. A real position, a meaningful one, in the team that managed the logistical infrastructure of his healthcare platform across 8 states. It required exactly the kind of systematic thinking and quiet, persistent competence that Rosa Mendez had been deploying in his household for 3 years. He offered it to her properly, not as a favor, but as a job. He had his HR director send her the official posting and asked her to apply if she was interested, to go through the standard process. He didn't want her to have the position because of him. He wanted her to have it because she'd earned it. She went through 3 interviews. She was offered the role on her own merits. On her last day as his housekeeper, Rosa stood in the kitchen of the estate in the late afternoon light and looked around at the home she'd cared for with such meticulous attention, and Ethan could see her processing something large and complex and private. Lily was at his feet, trying very seriously to teach Mr. Flops to stand upright on the kitchen floor without assistance. She was wearing the yellow dress with the embroidered flowers. "I don't know how to do this," Rosa said quietly. "I don't know how to thank a person for something this big." "You already did," Ethan said. "You did it by letting me help. That was the harder thing." 6 months after that Tuesday morning, when he'd noticed a torn yellow dress on a 3-year-old girl sitting on a staircase, Ethan Blackwood sat in a conference room in his company's Hartford office, watching a presentation being delivered by the newest member of his operations leadership team. Rosa Mendez stood at the front of the room with the kind of quiet authority that had always been in her. It had just, for a while, been applied to managing households rather than managing divisions. She was walking the executive team through a logistics restructuring proposal she developed in her first 60 days, a proposal that his COO had described to Ethan privately as honestly one of the sharpest operational documents I've seen from someone at any level. Ethan sat in the back and said nothing, which was his preferred mode in meetings where other people deserved the room. He watched his team respond to her. Watched them lean forward, ask questions, take notes. Watched Rosa answer each question with precision and confidence, Not the brittle, defended confidence of someone performing competence, but the kind that came from knowing exactly what you were talking about, because you thought it through completely. He thought about the woman who had stood in his kitchen telling him she didn't want to be seen differently. He thought about the extraordinary courage it took, not to accept help, which was hard enough, but to transform the space that help opened up into something entirely yours. To walk through a door someone else unlocked and build a life on the other side of it through your own irreducible capability. After the meeting, the team dispersed into the usual post-meeting scatter of sidebar conversations and phone calls. Rosa stopped at his chair on her way out. "How do you think it went?" she asked, and for just a moment, he could see the anxious woman from the kitchen underneath the confident executive at the conference table. Both real, both her, layered in the complex way of people who have survived significant things. "I think," Ethan said, "that my COO is going to try to steal you from your current team within 6 months. I'd recommend asking for a raise before he does." Rosa laughed, that real, surprised laugh that he'd first heard in his kitchen when Lily had been talking to Mr. Flops. It was a good sound. It was the sound of a person who was actually okay. "Lily asked about you," Rosa said. "She wanted to know if you still have the big house with the stairs." Ethan smiled. "What did you tell her?" "I told her yes. She said she thinks Mr. Flops would like to visit again." Rosa paused. She also told her whole preschool class that her friend Ethan is a billionaire. "Her teacher sent me a very confused email." Ethan laughed, a real laugh, not performed, not polished. The kind that came from somewhere uncomplicated. "Tell Lily she and Mr. Flops are welcome anytime," he said. After Rosa left, Ethan sat alone in the conference room for a few minutes in the quiet that followed the end of a good meeting. The Hartford office looked out over the Connecticut River, silver and wide in the afternoon light, moving steadily toward the ocean the way rivers did, purposefully, without hesitation, indifferent to obstacles, because it had long since learned to go around them. He thought about something his father used to say, back in Dayton, in the apartment above the hardware store that smelled of motor oil and old wood. His father had been a man of few words, a man whose love was expressed almost entirely through action, through showing up, through staying, through the thousand small sacrifices that his son hadn't fully understood until he was old enough to do the math of what they'd cost. But he'd had this one saying that he'd offered on occasions when Ethan had felt the particular hopelessness of being small in a world built for larger people. "You can't light the whole city," his father had said, "but you can light the room you're in, and rooms add up." Ethan had thought about it the way children thought about parental wisdom, as something to acknowledge and file away, not yet equipped to truly understand it. He understood it now. He understood that the point was never the scope. The point was the specific, actual, irreplaceable human being in front of you. The Rosa who was too proud to ask for help. The Marco who had fallen and couldn't stop falling in the paperwork that followed. The Lily who held her rabbit with the solemnity of a child who understood that some things need to be loved carefully. You couldn't fix the system. You couldn't resolve the structural realities of workers' compensation fraud or medical debt, or the gap between a business degree and the economy's willingness to use it. You couldn't do any of that from a conference room or a kitchen island or the children's section of a Target on a Tuesday morning. But you could see the person in front of you. You could actually see them, not as a category, not as a problem, not as a reflection of your own generosity, but as a full human being carrying a weight you might be in a position to help shift, even slightly, even temporarily, enough for them to get their footing back. Rooms add up. The following Friday, Ethan attended the charity gala his PR team had been pushing, an annual event benefiting a foundation that supported families of injured workers navigating the workers' compensation system. He didn't just attend. He wrote a check that would fund the foundation's legal advocacy program for 3 years. He stood at the podium when they asked him to speak, and for once, he didn't talk about his company or his journey or his philosophy of innovation. He talked about a little girl in a torn yellow dress sitting on a staircase, talking to a rabbit. He talked about a mother who ran a household with the intelligence of an executive and the heart of someone who had decided that her dignity was the last thing she would surrender. He talked about his father in Dayton and what his father knew about lighting rooms. There wasn't a dry eye at a table that cost $12,000 a seat. But it wasn't about them, and Ethan knew it. He was talking to himself, really, reminding the 32-year-old billionaire who sometimes forgot what he was, for that wealth without witness was just accumulation. That power without attention was just noise. That the most important thing he'd done that year, possibly in several years, was stop walking through his own hallway long enough to crouch down to a 3-year-old's eye level and ask her the name of her rabbit. Mr. Flops. It was nice to meet him. Months later, Lily would graduate from preschool into kindergarten. Rosa would be promoted. Marco would walk without a cane. The yellow dress with the embroidered flowers would eventually be outgrown, as all things are outgrown, as people grow out of their hardest seasons and into something whiter and less torn. Rosa would pack it away in a box with a careful tenderness that mothers reserve for the artifacts of their children's earliest years. She would not throw it away, because it was the dress Lily was wearing the morning a man who could have kept walking chose to stop. And some moments deserve to be kept, even after they're outgrown, especially after they're outgrown, because the heart remembers what it came from, and what it came from is what tells it where to go. Some people change your life with grand gestures. Others change it by simply seeing you, truly, fully, without condition. The greatest gift one human being can offer another isn't money, or influence, or power. It's the willingness to stop, to look, to stay long enough to understand that the person in front of you is carrying something heavy, and to ask, quietly, without fanfare, without the need for credit, if they'd like a little help carrying it. That's what love looks like when it shows up in real life. Not perfect, not cinematic, just present.